Hi, I'm Pete Shau. You may know me from the RTO Show podcast, but today I'm doing something a little bit different. APRO and Wow Brands have launched a special project to bring the story of our industry to life like never before. They've asked me to sit down with some of the true legends of rent-to-own, capturing their stories, their impact, and their vision for the future. And now I get to share those conversations with you straight from the legends themselves. All of this leads to something groundbreaking, though. A new book, The Rent-to-Own Revolution, A Definitive History of Advocacy and Consumer Access, written by APRO CEO Charles Smitherman and Wow Brands CEO Brian Krass. The book explores the grassroots of RTO, the advocacy that has defined it, and the future that we're building together. Here's where you come in. We're giving away free copies once the book is released. Just head over to the RTORevolution.com and sign up for a chance to receive a copy in early 2026. Don't miss the chance to be among the first to hold this piece of RTO history. That's RTORevolution.com. Check it out and become a part of RTO history. Hello and welcome to the RTO Show. I'm your host, Pete Shau, and guess what? Today we're doing another legend. Now, you've seen him before. You've seen him on the show. Brad's going to be a regular on here before we're all done, but Brad Denison is probably somebody who has seen more on the other side of the fence than we have. It's not operations. This is all the main things that happened years ago as legal counsel for Rent-A-Center. Brad Denison, how you doing today?
Doing great. How are you?
I'm excellent. So got a question for you. Now that you've been doing this a long time, when are you doing your own podcasting?
That'll be a while, I think.
We're not going to do the Denison show anytime soon.
No, I think that's better left to people like you.
Well, we appreciate it. Listen, so I wanted to know, you are on the Legends series because a lot of the things that you've done, how long have you been doing rent to own right now, as whether it be on one side of the fence or the other?
So I joined Rent-A-Center back in June of 1991. So that's when I got my start. Left there in 2001, right before the 9/11. And then we bought some music stores, a couple of music stores and a live sound business out in Colorado Springs, and did actually rent to own music instruments there out of those stores. So renting tubas and trombones, trumpets. And then in 2006, Danny Wright, who founded BMS, asked me to come back and work for them. So kind of switched sides to the vendor side of things in 2006, and I've been there.
So we're talking about 1991, which is 34 years ago? Is that what we're talking about?
Sounds like it. Yeah.
So how did you get started? Where did you come in? Let's go back, I guess, a little bit more. What is your background? So you have a legal background as far as...
So, yeah, I was practicing, started my career practicing law in Wichita, Kansas, the home of Rent-A-Center at the time, and met different people in my career. And then in 1991, there was a person that I grew up with in Eureka, Kansas, my hometown, who worked at Rent-A-Center, and I was talking to her, and she said, Rent-A-Center's looking for another attorney. And somehow that got back to Ron DeMoss, who was an attorney for Rent-A-Center at the time. And Ron was familiar with me from the firm that Ron called me up and asked if I'd be interested in taking a look at Rent-A-Center. And to be honest, I had no familiarity with rent-to-own at the time. So it was an interesting set of interviews where I was kind of completely in the dark on what that industry involved and why they needed so many attorneys and the history of that. So it was something that I wasn't looking for, but glad I found it.
So in 1991, somebody comes to you, they tell you this is probably a good fit. Check it out. You check it out. You come on board. What was it about Rent-A-Center and rent to own at that time that made you decide, I'm going to give this a try, and then stay for as long as you have?
It actually wasn't anything about rent to own that drew me to Rent-A-Center. I was in private practice law doing litigation, and I actually loved what I was doing, had no intentions of leaving at all. In fact, when I took the job, when I finally talked to Ron and agreed that I'd come on board at Rent-A-Center, I sat at my desk and was just, uh, I was very sad to be leaving a life that I really loved. But what drew me to Rent-A-Center was Ron DeMoss and the other people at Rent-A-Center at the time, Chris Kors, Dave Egan, the people there that really convinced me that this was an exciting part of the company's growth, was what they're doing as far as legislatively litigation, and that it's very exciting. And I was attracted by the idea that you could go into a job instead of fighting battles for people that had already made a mistake and got in trouble, that you could help prevent a mistake or help structure a business so that it would avoid legal pitfalls in the future.
So I got to ask, because when you said that somebody came to you, they had an opening, it looks like they needed more. They needed a little bit more firepower. They needed a little bit more expertise on the bench. What was going on that time legally that Rent-A-Center or the rent-own industry needed somebody with your expertise to come on board and help them out? What was going on? What were the legal hot points at that time?
Well, at that juncture, there was a lot going on. I'm not sure, I think I was just hired because they needed additional people, not because I had the magic bullet that could cure all the Rent-A-Center or the rent-to-own issues that we were going through at the time. But, there were several class action litigation lawsuits going on that involved whether the transaction was a lease or a sale. And, for people that don't know about that battle, the whole issue that was in the middle of passing all the rent-to-own laws that now govern the transaction. But back then, during that process, there was still a big question of whether a transaction that allows somebody to get ownership at the end should fall over into the credit loan category or it should be in the lease category. And obviously, rent-to-own was structured so it had a little bit of both. You could get ownership, but there was no obligation at the outset or any time through the transaction. And so that was the argument and the battle that was being fought at that time. There were several class action lawsuits about it. There was also, a team of people out trying to pass laws and then also defending legislation that we.
So let me ask you a question. What route did you take with your, as you join, now you're in a group and Rent-A-Center as a legal team. How did that legal team, what approaches did you take to overcome or help overcome some of these class action lawsuits that we don't have now because we were able to win those battles then?
The battles on the class action front, at the outset, I wasn't directly involved in those, but I did handle the litigation for Rent-A-Center. Somebody sues saying that, the refrigerator that was delivered didn't work right or that somebody mistreated them somehow or was abusive in their collection practices. I handled all that litigation and other things in the legal department. But for the class actions litigation, that was just basically battling on the facts that even though this transaction does give ownership at the end, or there's a potential for ownership at the end, there's never an obligation to do that. And so in the history of the United States, that obligation is key to making something credit. You can't have a loan if there's no obligation to pay anything back. So it was really a battle based on the legal facts. And we were generally successful. We did have some losses, but more often than not, we won those battles. They were also, Rent-A-Center was battling on the bankruptcy front. So people in bankruptcy would say, I want to treat this transaction as a credit transaction. And so we battled all those. So I have a book somewhere, a notebook filled with all the bankruptcy cases that we battled, hundreds of them. And so that was constantly going on. Steve Smith, who was in our department, wrote an article with Barclay Clark, who was a very well-known professor at the time on UCC law, wrote a law review article about why rent-to-own is a lease, not a sale. And so that's kind of how that battle worked. And at the same time, everybody was busy with legislation.
Can you
try to fix it? Try to fix it in the legislature rather than battle it in the courts.
Right. Can you give me can you walk me through one of the can you walk me through one of the more memorable legislative fights that you had to go through?
I'm going to divert a little bit from the legislative fight and tell you a story, kind of put it in perspective. So I had come from a large law firm, second largest in Kansas. And so we'd done a lot of high-end litigation. We represented Amoco Oil and Koch brothers, different large entities. And so I came from a little different background. And so when I first started at Rent-A-Center, they handed me all the policy manuals and said, in your spare time, go read these. And so I took them home and I was reading through them. And I was like, man, it's a good thing they hired me, because these people are thinking that they're going to give very expensive equipment to people that have bad credit. That sounds like a horrible idea to me. Obviously, it's a horrible idea that's turned out to be a phenomenal idea that's benefited millions of customers that wouldn't have access to the goods that they now have access. And it's made, very good living for a lot of people in there.
Yeah, well, for sure.
From the legislative standpoint, so I probably started on the legislative side in 1995. Dave Egan, Chris Course, Ron DeMoss had handled the laboring oar on that for the company for the years prior to that, and done a phenomenal job. I remember when I started there, Chris Course was literally never in the office because he was always on the road, trying to pass legislation or battle bad legislation that tended to put us out of business. So I started in 95 or 96 and started passing some of the state laws. One of the funny stories, not about passing a law, but the law had been passed in Vermont, which was a little different than most of the state laws that we tried to pass. We had a model act that we would introduce in various states. But in Vermont, even though we'd passed this rent-to-own law, they were trying to put an APR, an annual percentage rate disclosure on the transaction, and require each rental dealer to disclose the annual percentage rate. Made no sense from a legal factual standpoint, but these were people that just didn't like rent-to-own and thought, we needed an APR, despite the fact that we had all these disclosures telling customers exactly how much they would pay if they rented to the inn, exactly how much they had to pay each week to keep the merchandise. So we were up there battling that. And as is typically the case when I would go into a state, we get local rental dealers, hopefully that some of them know some of the state legislators. And then we always tried to recruit a music dealer, because even though sometimes people don't understand why somebody would want to pay more money to rent something instead of just going down and plopping their credit card down, they do understand the music aspect of it, because most of them had rented instruments or their kids were renting instruments. So we show up with this music dealer, and the people on the committee all knew this person. He'd been around, I think, since the beginning of the state of Vermont. And so people were just going crazy over him, going, yeah, my dad rented a trumpet from you, I rented a trumpet from you, and now my son's renting a trumpet from you. And so I thought to myself, we have really got this nailed, because nobody's going to hurt this guy. And he did a great job of explaining why rent-to-own was important and why he needed it to stay in business. And so I really thought we had it. And somebody on the committee, yeah.
That's a good angle. I mean, I didn't really think about that, but that's a great angle to represent exactly what we do.
Yes, it was just easier to understand. The needs sometimes are a little bit different, but it puts the perspective of having a transaction that allows you to get in easy and get out easy, puts it in context that people can understand. Anyway, somebody on the committee kind of piped up and said, I've got an idea. Let's just exempt music instruments from the rent-to-own law.
That's not what we want.
We were back to the battle, but we eventually won. Anyway, there's funny things like that happen all the time. And in addition to local dealers and music dealers that we would recruit to help us with this. We'd also get customers because they told the best stories ever. There was one woman in Wisconsin that we were doing a video. We hired a videographer to do interviews of customers coming in and out of the store. And so the videographer said to this woman coming out of the store is, what do you rent? She said, I rent a TV. And she said, well, the AG is challenging this transaction, saying that, it shouldn't exist. You should have to use credit to get your TV. What do you have to say to that? She said, well, the AG probably has a TV. I don't.
To put it in perspective, he might have a TV, but I do not. You gotta love the stories. Some of my notes are telling me, as I'm doing a little bit of research, that there were some pretty hot states around that time frame. Was there anything in those states that kind of stood out to you that really made them seem like they were hot spots?
The states that were the hot spots while I was there, really hot spots, were Wisconsin, Minnesota, and New Jersey. And then those are the states where we were trying to pass a law. Even though we'd actually already passed a law in Minnesota, that was an interesting case because there was a class action lawsuit pending in Minnesota and against Rent-A-Center. Rent-A-Center won that class action lawsuit. So lease versus sale convinced the court that it was a lease. And so we won that lawsuit. While that lawsuit was pending, we passed a law, a rent-to-own law that says this is a credit sale, not a lease. This is a lease, not a credit. After that, we had another class action that somehow the court was able to find that it was a credit sale, not a lease, even though the law clearly stated otherwise. And that's why, to this day, even though there's a rent-to-own law on the books, people aren't doing rent-to-own in Minnesota because of that court.
Well, while you mention it too, Wisconsin and New Jersey aren't the greatest rent-to-own states either. As a matter of fact, I think there are a lot less dealers in those states, if any dealers at all. Are they all basically set up that way? Is Wisconsin, along with Minnesota and New Jersey, kind of in the same boat as far as the laws that are concerned in those states?
So Wisconsin and New Jersey do not have rent-to-own laws. One of the two, there's 47 state laws, I believe, and so they're one of the two that don't have a law. Minnesota has a law, but the court system chose to ignore it. So in Wisconsin, the AG there way back in the 90s took the position that it's a credit. So, there's companies up there that are doing variations of rent-to-own, I believe, and then companies that are just doing credit up there, which obviously limits the number of people that you can offer the transaction.
So you've been doing this.
Jeff Liebachen and I literally wore out multiple pairs of shoes walking around the state house in Wisconsin trying to tell the rent-to-own story. And we were able to get it actually passed out of both houses a couple of times and just couldn't get it past the governor.
Yeah. Well, it's a fight for sure, and when you talk about going back that far, APRO has a starting point that was much earlier than that. Was RAC a part of APRO at that time, and how did you guys coordinate to get some of this stuff done?
So at what point in time? When I was involved? 91
to 95, 96.
Yeah. So, we would coordinate. I was at one point chairman of the Government Relations Committee at APRO, so we'd discuss all the states. So, typically we'd have 2 or 3, maybe 4 states where we were trying to pass laws, but then we'd have a list of 6, 7, sometimes 10 states where somebody was trying to repeal a rent-to-own law or introduce an amendment to it that would cause problems. And so, we would coordinate with APRO. APRO would help get the Rental Dealer Association involved. And then, I would come in and work on the bill language. And again, we were working most of the time off of a model act. And so I would meet with all the state legislators. Rent-A-Center would hire lobbyists in those states and go meet with the state legislatures. We'd recruit a bill sponsor to do it and try in both houses get a bill sponsor, and then basically go and that was when the hard work began of going office to office, trying to convince people to tell the story and try to convince people that it was a good story. And frankly, the good story part was fairly easy for most people. There's certain people that just believe if you're renting stuff to people that have less money, you should be charging them less, not more. And, that's a difficult hurdle to overcome, but we did it in most cases. And, 47 state laws, we were successful in doing that. The harder part, for the most part, was convincing somebody that this was a worthwhile cause. Not that rent-to-own is bad or good, but there's only so many bills they can pass in a year. Why should this be one? One time at the federal level, it was interesting because I was in a congressman's office, and he said, "So why should I do this for you?" And I said, "Because it's the right thing to do." And he goes, "Son, see all those filing cabinets over there? Those are all full of right things to do. Why should I do yours?" And so that was the hurdle. You're not curing cancer. You're not making the school system better. And so it's more difficult to get across how important this is to the population that needs rent to own, and how much of a benefit this is to the communities in which the rent to own stores exist. And so once we were able to tell that story, obviously we had great success.
Is that really what kind of made it hold up over time, is the fact that we've been able to say, we're going back into these communities where you would say that somebody is kind of having a difficult time, where we are going into the communities and giving them the opportunity to get the furniture, the appliances, the electronics that they need to be able to do homework, to be able to keep their house cool, to be able to sleep at night, to be able to basically, I don't want to say babysit the kids, but, give them something to do during the day, whether it be game systems, TVs, radios, laptops, tablets, whatever the case is. Is that really a sticking point that really kind of helped drive that home?
Yeah, it is. I think so. We told that story. Here's why this transaction needs to exist and needs to be regulated the way we're proposing that it be regulated. And so we told that story. I think it's a great story. But I think what has helped is, over the decades that these laws have existed, what we said has been proven to be true. So, there hasn't been widespread problems with this causing issues. And if you talk to the rent-to-own customers, which is, we had them testify, that's where you get the stories of saying, "I need this, I want this." And what's even more important, I think, is I understand it. I understand that I'm paying more to have the flexibility and the access to this merchandise that no one else is going to give me. And so I think when people understood that people got it, they knew what the price was, and they're making a conscious choice to do that because it fit their lifestyle and their needs and their current situation. I think that worked, and I think that's proven to be the truth over the last 30 years.
Let me ask you a question. As you're going into this and you're talking to some of the legislative branches, you're talking to some of the legislators themselves, you're going back and forth, you're wearing the shoes down, you're kind of sitting them down and explaining the stories to them. Were there any unexpected compromises or trade-offs that you had to make during these situations to get it done?
There were several. I wasn't in the initial bill. I wasn't directly involved, but California is a perfect example. If you look at California versus the standard, what I would call the standard rent-to-own legislation, it puts more of a burden on the rent-to-own dealer as far as damage to the property. It limits the ability to sell an extended service contract during the term of the rent-to-own transaction. And there are a number of things in there that just make it more difficult to do rent-to-own. But at the time, the choice really was go in without any protection from a rent-to-own bill that said this is a legitimate transaction and here's how it fits in legal scheme or agree to provisions in the bill that made it more difficult and less desirable.
I know that California is one of the most progressive states in the country, and sometimes they are the leading edge of something great, and sometimes they're also on the backside of trying to get something done and just having to jump through a lot of hurdles to get that to happen. And I know that rent to own on our sense has always kind of shied away from California and some reasons, because of those laws that they have in place. We don't have as much rent to own representation in that state as we would like to have, especially because it's one of the largest states in the country.
Right. Well, and that's the thing that I think people in the rent to own industry understand that maybe not everybody understands. Putting those restrictions in the bill limits access. It doesn't make the transaction cheaper. It doesn't make it easier to get into the transaction for the consumer. There's nothing in there that helps the consumer. Like I said, I think the testament is these other bills that have been around for 30, 40 years have proven to be effective in regulating the transaction. Back when I was doing it, I can't remember exactly, but when you looked at the Better Business complaints against rent-to-own companies, there were fewer rent-to-own Better Business Bureau complaints than there were against florists. So it is not.
Wow.
The rent-to-own people understand that they've got to take care of their customer. If you have an unhappy customer, you have a person that's returning the rental, and they're going to go down the street to another rent-to-own dealer. And so just built into the transaction is the need to make sure your customer is always happy. And I think that's worked, and I think that served the industry well to make sure that no one looks at it and says, wow, we passed this rent-to-own law 20 years ago and it's just not working. Just the opposite. Anybody that looks at it says this is working extremely well to regulate the industry. There's not problems. So I think that's it. And I think the flip side of that, though, is the people that are currently in rent to own that just got into it in the last 10 years or the last 5 years don't understand how much danger the rent to own industry was in back in the 80s. And Pennsylvania is a perfect example where there was a time when people weren't doing rent to own in Pennsylvania because of the AG there. That's been fixed now legislatively, but there was a time at the federal level and in various states where we didn't know whether the rent to own industry was going to be able to continue to do business. And now that's been pretty much quiet. There's been some hiccups along the way. New York, I think, has introduced some things, and it hadn't been perfect. But as a general matter, comparing today versus 20 years ago, the landscape is much more smoother sailing for it. But it's important, I think, for the people that just got in late in the game to understand that that could change and that it's important to do things right, to support the legislative efforts. But, APRO, I think, has done a phenomenal job of keeping people, going to Washington, D.C. every year, despite the fact that there hadn't been a bad bill introduced for the last, 15, 20 years. So I think those things are still very important. When I was on the Government Relations Committee, when I was chairman of the Government Relations Committee, people would say, once we get this federal law passed, then we can stop spending all this money. And my response to them was, once we get the bill passed, we're going to have to spend just the same amount of money because we got to make sure people don't forget why we have this bill and why it's important to protect the industry and protect consumers' right to have that transaction.
Let me ask you a question. What years did you serve as the chairman?
Boy, I don't know. Probably 96 to maybe 99 or 97 to 99. Or
You got in 91. You left in 2001. So that gave you a decade of doing exactly what we're talking about here. Now, talking about the reforms and you being on the Rent-A-Center side. Now, I know that you were doing the legal parts and you had some wins and some losses on the legal side, but was there ever a time where there had to be like an internal reform from Rent-A-Center to make it better or more suitable, something a little bit better, and say, you know what, we'll tweak this internally, or we'll tweak that with the customers, or we'll tweak that with the way that we do things and our operations and our manuals to make it better or more suitable for the legislative to say, okay, you know what, I like that. I can go with that.
Yeah. I, when I joined in 1991, I think Rent-A-Center was on a good path at that time, as far as they had, prior to my joining Rent-A-Center, come out with this, I guess you'd call it a campaign calling respect. And the idea was to respect the rent-town customer, and that would pay off for the company, as far as treating people right, making sure you're servicing them. And it showed, like when I was there, we had store managers that were best men at rent-town customers' weddings. We had weddings in the store, and it was not unusual for some of our rent-town store personnel to be pallbearers at funerals. So, I don't think Rent-A-Center is unique in that regard. I think that's what's made this industry so strong, is the relationships and the kind of taking care of the customer first that really work. But, I wasn't around before 1991, but I've heard stories that before, in the 80s, there were some dealers that may not have got that message. And so I think APRO did a phenomenal job. Again, I'm looking back, and it wasn't my personal experience, but APRO did a phenomenal job of self-policing the industry. When I first joined, I know they had a code of conduct, and I think that went a long way in really calling out dealers that weren't following that code of conduct, to say you need to do better. And I think if you look at the industry today, that worked. I mean, I don't think you have those people that are out there doing things that we'd all be ashamed of.
Well, I think in previous podcasts and interviews, we've talked about some of the bad actors that we had back then. And I like to say it back then because I'm with you. I think there's been a good overall mix of, whether it be APRO, whether it be TRIB, whether it be the RDAs, the renter dealer associations on the state level, saying, hey, guys, we've got to treat this properly, because where one domino starts, there is a fall. Just like if we're getting it passed in states, we have momentum. Hey, this passed in this state, that's passed in that state. We are a state that doesn't have this, but as you can see, it's being accepted across the United States. That can also happen in reverse. You get that one fire and it's like, hey, this is not right. We shouldn't be doing this to customers, or this shouldn't be happening. And whether it's right or wrong, there's a sentiment that goes along with it on how it makes the customers feel in their opportunities. And if somebody feels like you're infringing on their rights or their opportunities, they're going to stand for it. And then it can go in the opposite direction. Well, hey, this state says that this is not a good idea. Why don't we start taking in that direction? That's why I think the fight in New York is so important, to get them to realize, like you've said before, and I think has been said many times, the laws have been passed. The state is regulated. It is working just fine. There are quite a few people that actually work in this industry, and it does a lot for the industry. So we're talking about owners. We're talking about people who rent the buildings to these owners. We're talking about the people who work in these places. We're talking about what they pay as far as taxes and utilities and vehicles, and how they supply the communities with this product, whatever that product might be, to all these people out there. And it provides such a service. We wouldn't be in a multi-billion-dollar industry if it didn't. And somebody comes along and says, I think credit plays a little bit more in this than we're saying. And I think that's a fight that really has to be had. It's as important as it is to us, and as important it is to some of the regular, the RDAs in New York and around those areas. It's great to see that APRO has people like yourself who have been involved. How important is it, in your opinion, to have these vendors? Because now, you are out of the Rent-A-Center side, you are with Benefit Marketing Solutions, but as a vendor, you still help participate. And in your opinion, how important, how integral is it to have the vendors participate with APRO and other organizations to be heard on the federal level?
Well, I do think it's important. Number one, it's a different perspective. And I think, having different perspectives in front of a member of Congress or at the state level is always important. I failed to mention that when we were battling in Wisconsin, Ashley Furniture did a great job contacting state legislators in Wisconsin, and saying, hey, look, this is important to us. It's important to people in our community. And it was a great help. I think it's been so long that I've forgotten all in vendors that when I was at Rent-A-Center that we got involved, but Whirlpool was involved, and we had other vendors that were helping out with the legislation because, like with most things, you can look at it from a dealer's perspective and say, from a dealer's perspective, here's why we want you to pass this law. But really, that's only a small part of the story. The other part of the story is from a consumer standpoint, from one of your constituents standpoint, why should you pass this law? And then there's the other part of it of, this doesn't stay within the dealer and the consumer. It impacts other people. It impacts vendors, the community that the vendor serves. So, when Ashley Furniture does well, people in that community do well. And so, like every other industry, it's not just limited to a guy that owns a rent-to-own shop and a handful of his customers.
Now, as you're going through and you're talking to these legislators, whether you're a vendor or whether you've been in the industry and you're advocating for the industry as within the industry, how much do you think the FTC played in the opposite end of, hey, this is probably more of a credit transaction than a rental transaction?
Well, I've forgotten a lot about the FTC because it's been so long ago. But ultimately, they came out fairly consistent with our position. They had some positions that, we didn't like, but for the most part, I don't think ultimately, maybe not at the outset, they saw it.
Well, I'm hoping that the more people that we get on one side, and it's not like you're going to win the battle, it's that seesaw. And the more people that you have on your side, the easier it is to make your case. But, you still have those situations, again, like in New York or, the Henry B. Gonzalez situation that happened a little bit before you came on, where there's people that are going to dig their heels in and make a stand no matter what you do. And I think there's a saying that goes, you can fool all of the people all the time, or some of the people all the time. Well, you know what? You can't please everybody all of the time either, no matter what you do. I don't think there's a situation where you're going to be able to blanket the entire United States or whatever you're trying to do and say, is this good enough for everybody? Because at some point, somebody's going to say, this isn't where it is. How do you fight that when you have those people who really dig in and get legislative to see, okay, you're not going to say that you won over every single person. We're not at 100%, but the blanket majority, there's got to be a way to say the majority of people find this to be relatively better in their arena and in what they do in their lives. What is it you get them to look at to see, what? Yes, you might have a person here and you might have a person there who says it's not, but overall, the Better Business Bureau has less complaints than the flower guys. I've got a musician here. Where did those ideas come from to put that together when you're making your case?
Well, I think I think it came from a variety of people and a variety of sources. Some of it is just from doing it over and over again. Obviously, I didn't come up with the idea of including music dealers. Somebody way before me did that. But it works and, made a lot of sense. But there's always going to be people that have a different perspective than we do. They say you shouldn't be charging people that can least afford it more money than you would charge a rich person. And you may not convince them of that, but when it comes to convincing enough people and enough important people like legislators, that there's a reason for that. And, it's just really the facts. If you look at it, you can't operate it. The people that use rent-to-own generally need flexibility. They need to be able to enter into a transaction without, going through the whole banking process and having a credit score that is, 800. They need that kind of access. And then when you look at it, when they get laid off from their job or, somebody moves in with them that has a TV, the ability to be able to return that, or their kid needs braces, whatever the case may be, more so than somebody that's making $1 million a year. They need more flexibility in how they acquire goods. And so you can look at it just from a fractional standpoint. And at the time I was doing it, I think there were 3 or 4 publicly traded rent-to-own companies. And you could look at their bottom line and their bottom line wasn't different than a bank or somebody that's doing consumer credit. In fact, typically the margin was lower. And it's because the expenses are higher in doing a transaction that allows somebody to return it a week later. And frankly, there's more expense in giving merchandise to somebody that may not have a good track record. Some of that ends up in a pawn shop, or some of it ends up driving away and going out of state and you never see it again. So once you can supply those facts, factually, the rent-to-own industry has got an incredible story. And that's how you can convert some people. I mean, there were instances where over time you convert a legislator who originally said, I had this consumer group telling me that you guys are bad guys. And over time you can present them with facts and let them talk to their constituents, and they say, I get it now. It's pretty easy to get once they see it and once they're presented with everything. But, back then that was a big battle. I think over time, like I said, like with everything, if it works over 30, 40 years, people, start questioning it as much as they did 30 or 40 years ago.
I think we're seeing a lot of that now. And I think we see that a lot in the youth, is that they've come across something that has been here for a long time. They don't understand why it's there. And so they want to question the fact of its validity and find out, why is it really here? Do we really need it? I mean, without going through the steps that enacted people to step out and do those things to create the law or create whatever it is, they kind of lost sight of it. So sometimes they have that checkpoint. We've got to remind them, this is what it could be without.
Right.
Just curious, how do you think the role of compliance and ethics has evolved from your GC days?
Well, look, I think when I was at Rent-A-Center, I think they were on top of their game as far as making sure that they did things right. We had I think at one point we had like 12 attorneys, and we were constantly reviewing our operations, looking through policy manuals to make sure that we were complying, not just with the law, like we would comply with the Collections Practices Act, even though it didn't apply to our situation in our company. But we voluntarily said we're going to comply with that because we thought it was the right thing to do as far as positioning the company. We passed these laws that said we're going to make, we voluntarily said we're going to submit ourselves to regulation so that, everybody in the industry is competing on the same footprint as far as making all these disclosures to make sure that the customers know what they're getting into. So, I'd like to think things have gotten better. Just hopefully over time, everybody has accepted that this is the right thing to do. And then they go, next stair step is, how could we even do that better? And so hopefully the industry's gotten better. From my viewpoint of it, it looks like it has. So, I'm proud of it. And, one of the things to put things in perspective as far as where this industry was, where it is today. Again, I've got the stories from pre-1991, and then I lived it for 10 years from 91 to 2001. But when I was there, and I know this is true to prior to when I was, this wasn't a job for me or any of the other people at Rent-A-Center or in the industry. It was a mission. Last year I was at Rent-A-Center. I took 45 legislative trips, 45 out of 52 weeks. And
wow.
And the thing is that using Wisconsin as an example, Jeff Liebach, I don't know how many months we spent in Wisconsin, literally from 8 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock at night, roaming the halls looking for legislators to talk to us. But we did that, for days at a time, for weeks at a time, for months at a time. And the people that were on the Government Relations Committee in APRO really believed in this mission, and they dedicated their life to it. I mean, it went above just showing up for a job. I think that's what has made the industry successful, because I can tell you when I started in 1991, there wasn't a lot of warm fuzzies about the rent-to-own industry. There were a lot of people out there that thought we were, not treating our customers right. And I think if you look at it now, that's turned around. And I think that's because of all these people that went over and above, way over and above, dedicating their own resources, their time and money to attend APRO events, to go out and speak to state legislatures, federal legislators. And I'm so proud of what this industry has done and the people involved in it. It's incredible to me that APRO did a great job. And, it starts back in their original meeting with Ed Wynn, the first executive director of APRO. They got together on a mission, and wow, look at all that's been accomplished.
I completely agree. I got a question for you. What's your most, because you mentioned the word proud, it stuck out with me. What are you most proud from your time in fighting all these legal battles with Rent-A-Center as general counsel?
It's funny because probably the thing I'm most proud of wasn't necessarily a victory. Wisconsin, we did a great job there. I say we because there was a lot of people involved, customers involved, local rental dealers. We did a lot of hard, good work there to convince a state that was truly set against us. Like I said, we got our bill passed out of both houses. A long story about why we didn't get it past the governor, but to get a bill like we did in the environment we were in, passed out of both houses.
I could see, I mean, from the way you discuss it and the way you sound, I could see that it means a lot to you at that point in time and how much work you put in to get that done. And then here we are, years later, you've decided to kind of make a little bit of a pivot, and you're with Benefit Marketing Solutions. How does that pivot work in your career? And what do you do now that still helps advocate for the industry with BMS?
Well, a number of us from BMS go up to Washington, D.C. every year and take part in the legislative conference and go, office to office, telling the rent-to-own story and telling it. I can tell it not only from the rent-to-own perspective, but also from the vendor perspective. But then, I'm going to forget the year. It's probably been 7 or 8 years ago. Indiana had always caused the rent-to-own industry problems. The rent-to-own law there, they had interpreted it as if it's not specifically included, it's excluded. So there's no place in the Indiana rent-to-own law that says you can do a club program like the BMS offers. And so for most of the time that the Indiana law was in place, dealers in Indiana couldn't do a club program. And obviously, we've got millions of customers that benefit from having a club program. We have hundreds of dealers that benefit from being able to offer their customers that. So when customers unemployed, it keeps them renting. So it helps everybody. But in Indiana, they couldn't do that. So 7, 8 years ago, the Dealers Association asked me to get involved and go up and try to help pass an amendment to the Indiana rental purchase law that allowed for a club program. And so we were able to do that. Didn't eliminate all the problems in Indiana, but we did get that law passed. And
well, congratulations on that win. That sounds like a very big win.
It was. And again, that was, a group effort. The Indiana Rental Dealers Association is a super strong association, and it's been strong for a long time. I remember back, in the mid-90s, Indiana was one of the states where just every year somebody would introduce a bad bill to repeal the rent-to-own law. And the association would get together. I would go to Indiana, and we would really successfully get that stopped in pretty short order. But it's because of how strong the state association was to do that. And then, we have various states that where something's going on, and we'll participate and donate our own money to help support the industry through individual contributions to some legislator that's helping.
Well, I think that
I don't want that to be an invitation for everybody to come asking for money, but when it's important and necessary, we try to step in and do that.
Oh, absolutely.
We're all in this together. If the rent-to-own industry doesn't thrive, we don't thrive. So we know that we're going to do our part.
Well, that's definitely the the togetherness that we need, the ability to, be hand in hand with the industry, as well as, because I'm with you right there. As far as this podcast concerns, if the industry doesn't do so well, I don't think the podcast is going to do so well either. So I'm 100% with you on that one. You know, in the final thoughts, I mean, where do you see the next frontier of RTO advocacy coming from? And what more could we do to help out in areas like, let's say, New York?
Well, I think first and foremost, take care of the customers because, I think if the customers are happy, there's going to be less bad stories to tell to a legislator that gets them fired up saying, hey, we got to do something about this. And, most of our cases, as far as class action litigation or bad legislation, came from a bad story. And so less bad stories, less problem. And I think it's, continuing with that, being able taking care of your customer. The customers, when I was doing it, were the best witnesses at a committee hearing as far as telling why it's important to them, why they understand, because of the law that currently exists in New York, why they know what they're paying. They're okay with that. They've evaluated that against other alternatives that they have, and they believe rent town is the best. And then, operating your business the way it should be. And, when called upon, like I think it's more important probably for the local rental dealers to be involved in New York than say like us at BMS. But, show up for your state association, be involved in your state association and get to know your local legislator. If you're a rental dealer in New York, you should know everybody that represents you and represents your store.
I think that's huge. I don't think that people do that enough. At least nowadays, I've seen that, they kind of just see everything on TV or they see something on a video that's been streamed and they're just like, they're too far away. And the truth is, they're not. You should know their names. You should know what district you're in. You should know who's over your district. You should know who's on either side of the fence, whether it be Democrat, whether it be Republican, whether they are in the House or the Senate, whatever the case is, really should know those people. And the truth is that, they're human just like we are. They make mistakes just like we do, just like they do their best to do the jobs that they've been tasked to do. And they're going to do it with the information they have. And if they don't have the information of what we do every single day, it's going to be very difficult for you to get something in the favor of an industry that we're in right now. So I'm very, very happy to say that Brad Denison was on our side for 10 years and now is part of BMS. Do me a favor. Not everybody know, and I say that as in, a lot of people know BMS because BMS is everywhere. But what are some of the benefits that BMS adds to the rental program so that people can feel like this is a better deal?
So each dealer can construct their own program, but generally speaking, where we, I think, bring the most value to the rental dealer and to the customers is if somebody becomes unemployed while they're a member of the club, it waives their rental payments for up to 4 months. Let them get back on their feet, hopefully find another job. But for the rental dealer, what's important is it keeps that customer on rent. Because I think the studies have shown in the rent-owned industry, if somebody leaves, even if they leave on favorable terms, they're more likely to go back to another store than to come back to you. So it keeps them on rent, keeps them going. Same thing, if there's a fire, flood, lets them continue on a rental agreement, same place that they left off, which is important because, most of the dealers in the industry offer liability damage waiver, LDW, and great product because it waives the customer's liability if something bad happens. If they have a fire or a theft, they no longer owe the rental dealer. The problem is if they're 2 weeks away from paying off that refrigerator, they don't have a refrigerator. So they've either got to go back and start over. Our program allows them to pick up where they left off, make 2 more payments, and the refrigerator is yours. So it really helps the rental dealer keep that customer happy, helps the customer. And then in addition, we have a number of other benefits, accident assist. So if a kid throws a shoe through the TV screen, takes care of it there.
That happens all too often in rent to own.
But then when something bad is not happening, we have benefits in the program like telemedicine, where kid gets, sore throat at 2:00 in the morning, the mother can call without leaving her home and schlepping her kid across town, can call and actually get a prescription over the phone. No charge to the customer at all. They have to pay for the prescription when they go to their pharmacist, but the talking to a doctor costs them no money whatsoever.
I think that's a huge benefit of BMS.
And there's other benefits in there. We got discounts on dental, discounts on dining and shopping, discounts on roadside assistance, number of other benefits that help people when they're not having problems. And our shopping discount covers a number of things, online shopping, but where I think most people get the most benefit is in the food discounts, like pizza. It's like buy one, get one free. And a lot of our stores use it, demonstrating to their people, hey, look, if your customer uses this thing twice a month, they paid for the club program. So that's how it helps. It gives the customers a better life, lets their dollar go a little further. But probably the most important thing is when something bad happens, the rent-to-own customers are the people that are least able to absorb that kind of tragic event, and we help them. 3 or 4 years ago, I can't remember the name of the hurricane that went through the southern part of the United States, but we wrote a check to one rent-to-own store for $100,000.
Wow.
For damage to merchandise that was damaged by the hurricane. But that helps the rental dealer, obviously. But if you think about it, that's $100,000 in rental payments that the customer, we put them back to where they were before the hurricane happened, like nothing ever happened. And so that's a big impact on that community.
Well, I got to say, that's Brad Denison on the benefits of benefit marketing solutions. Probably one of the best things about rent to own is that you don't only get to have this when you have it in time of need. You don't need credit. You can get it fairly easily, but you can also get it with all the extras that Brad adds onto it with his experience for years and years and years, on top of being general counsel at Rent-A-Center between 91 to 2001. You've kind of done a lot in the industry without being in the operations, and we appreciate it so much. You have it sounds like there's a lot of passion when you talk about a lot of the things that you've done and all the walking, all the hard work, all the late nights that you've put into it to get those successes in those states. Brad, I don't think we could be doing it without you. We really do appreciate it. We appreciate you being on the show, especially what you do at BMS and kind of helping us out, give that value back to the customer. Guys, I want to tell you, I always appreciate you guys watching. If you have any questions for Brad or myself on today's topic, or just being a legend himself and you want to reach out, hit me up, Pete at the RTOshowpodcast.com. You can also go online and hit me up at www.thertoshowpodcast.com. You can hit me up on there, or the DMs. We have Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube where you're going to see this. Brad, I'm going to tell you, I really appreciate you being on here and all the knowledge that you've given us. It's been a pleasure. And I will tell you guys, as always, get your collections low to get your sales high. Have a great one. Hey everyone, it's Pete Shau here from the RTO Show podcast, and I want to tell you about a company that's making a real difference in the rent-to-own space, Wow Brands. I've seen firsthand how they approach marketing. And let me tell you, it's not just about ads. Wow Brands builds complete digital ecosystems designed specifically for the rent-to-own industry. Their e-commerce and lead generation strategies are built to bring in qualified leads. And did I mention that they are actively working with the rent-to-own industry while also being members of APRO and TRIB? Listen, these folks are passionate problem solvers. They don't just slap something together. They design, build, and scale the kind of digital retail tools your business needs and your customers actually want. So if you're serious about growing, reach out to Wow Brands at wowbrands.com. I trust them, and I think you will too.